In third grade, we're starting chapter 7 of The Haunted Hotel. By 9 in the morning, the three families were down in the lobby. Ruth Rose's parents had treated them all to breakfast at Ellie's diner. Then they'd walk back to the hotel for their luggage. While the adults thanked Mr. Linkletter and the Spivets, the kids huddled on the sofa. "What are we going to do?" Dink asked. "Mr. and Mrs. Spivets are selling the hotel today." Ruth Rose pulled the white hair from her pocket. "This proves that someone is just pretending to be the ghost," she said, "but we don't know who or why." "Maybe one of the guests has white hair," Josh said. "Josh, all the guests are gone except Mr. and Mrs. Jeffers. And they both have dark hair," Ruth Rose reminded him. "Could the hair be from a wig?" Dink asked. "The ghost could have been wearing a costume and makeup." "That's it," Josh cried. "Last night I smelled makeup in the hall. I remember the yucky smell from last Halloween." Just then Mr. Linkletter walked over to the kids. He looked even more unhappy than he had the day before. "This is a sad day," Mr. Linkletter said. "Each Rail and Rook will be here at noon with papers." "Noon!" Ruth Rose jumped up. "Then we will have 3 hours." Mr. Linkletter gazed down at her. "I'm afraid it's too late." He shook his head and walked away. "We have to find out who's pretending to be the ghost," Ruth Rose said. "If we don't, Livy and Mr. Linkletter will lose their jobs. And Mr. and Mrs. Spivets will lose their home," Dink added. "Guys, I think I know who the ghost is," Josh said. Dink and Ruth Rose stared at him. "Well," Dink said, "who?" "The only people left in the hotel are Livy, Mr. Linkletter, and his aunt and uncle, right?" "Right," Ruth Rose said. "And we know that none of them want the hotel to be torn down," Josh continued. "You forgot about Mr. and Mrs. Jeffers," Dink said. "They're still here." Josh grinned. "Bingo. The Jefferses?" Ruth Rose said. "But they said they saw the ghost outside their room." "Sure they saw the ghost," Josh said. "One of them is the ghost." "I know how we can find out," Dink said. "We have to search their room." "Mr. Linkletter will never let us do that," Josh said. "Well, maybe he won't let us, but I know someone who might," Ruth Rose said. "Who?" asked Dink. "Livy." The kids said goodbye to their families, then hurried to the door that led to the basement. They found Livy in a cozy room drinking a cup of tea. She was wearing her maid's uniform. "Morning, kids," she said. "What brings you down here?" "We saw the ghost last night," Ruth Rose said. Livy's eyes widened. "Really? Where? Tell me." The kids explained about spending the night in the hotel and hiding in the cleaning closet. "It was so creepy," Josh said. "First we heard all these weird noises. Then this thing came out of nowhere. It glowed," Ruth Rose said. She showed Livy the white hair. "And we found this." "We think the ghost is one of the guests wearing a costume and wig," Dink explained. Suddenly, Livy let out a gasp. "It was a wig!" she cried. "What was?" Ruth Rose asked. "I just remembered," Livy said. "Yesterday I was in 301 getting ready to vacuum when I looked under the bed for shoes and stuff. I saw this hairy white thing. I thought it was a rat, but it could have been a white wig." "Who's in room 301? Dink asked. Livy shrugged. "I don't know their name, but they're a nice couple from New York." "Could you let us in so we could check the room for clues?" Ruth Rose asked. Livy shook her head. "Sorry, but you know how Mr. Linkletter is about the guests' privacy." "But Mr. and Mrs. Spivets hired us to get rid of the ghost," Dink said. "Besides, if they have to sell the hotel, you and Mr. Linkletter will lose your jobs." "And Mr. and Mrs. Spivets will have to move," Ruth Rose added. "Please, Livy, it won't take us long." Livy took a moment to think. "Okay," she finally said, "but just for 2 minutes." "Hey, what's this?" Josh had stuck his hand into a small opening in one wall. "That's an old dumbwaiter," Livy explained. "In the old days, the hotel sent food up to the guests. Each room had one of these little elevator things. When the food got up there, the guests just opened the door and pulled out their food tray." "Our room didn't have one," Dink said. "None of them do anymore," Livy said. "When the hotel closed its kitchen, the dumbwaiters were all sealed up." She pointed to the one in her wall. "That's the only hole left." Josh stuck his head back into the opening. "Cool! This thing goes all the way up." "Right," Livy explained. The shaft is still there, but the openings into the rooms were covered over. Josh yelled, "Hello!" into the empty shaft. His voice came echoing back. Livy finished her tea. "Okay, let's go," she said. "I'll be glad when Mr. Linkletter is back to normal again. He's even grouchier than usual." Livy took the kids up to the third floor, then knocked on room 301. When no one answered, she unlocked the door and pushed it open. "Please don't touch anything," she said. She knelt down and peeked under both beds. "Oh, the wig's gone!" The kids looked around the room. "Maybe it's in the closet," Ruth Rose whispered. Livy pulled open the closet door. On the top shelf sat a plastic head wearing a spiky white wig. "That's it," Josh said. "Can you take it down?" Dink asked. Livy carefully took the head down and set it on the table. Ruth Rose removed the white hair from her pocket and held it next to the wig. "The hairs are the same." That's the end of chapter 7.